Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, or good morning, it depends on where you are. Welcome to the Rainbow Push Coalition and Citizenship Education Fund's annual Media and Telecommunications Symposium. This year, we've chosen to do things a bit differently due to us being in the wake of the pandemic by hosting our Media and Telecom Symposium online. This year's theme is Charting a Path Forward for Digital Education and Economic Inclusion. And today we are in session 3 of the entire meeting. The first day we dealt with digital education and remote learning. And then the second day we dealt with what COVID-19 has taught us about digital equity and the Federal Communications Commission. Today we're going to engage in the discussion on what technology policies can benefit communities of color. Our moderator today is Mr. Bertram Lee. Before we go into our discussion, I want to let you all know that our conversation is open to questions. If you have any questions, you can list those questions at the bottom of the Facebook Live feed, or you can go to Twitter and hashtag RPC Telecom 2020. Hashtag RPC Telecom 2020. On behalf of Reverend Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition, we're delighted that you joined us here on our online Media and Telecom Symposium. Now I want to turn this over to our moderator, Mr. Bertram Lee.
Thank you, Reverend Smith. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Media Telecom Symposium session, What Technology Policies Can Benefit Communities of Color. My name is Bertram Lee. I am Policy Counsel with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's largest civil rights coalition, doing tech and media policy. Today we have a conversation with a distinguished panel that I am excited to introduce. First, we have Ms. Marita Coley-Flippin, Esquire. She is the Multimedia, Telecom, and Internet Council's president and CEO. She is a lawyer, social impact leader, and former media executive with extensive experience in media, telecom, and internet law and policy and business operations. Immediately prior to MMTC, she serves as the chief executive officer of the Capital Area Asset Builders, a leading nonprofit in community economic development and asset building in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Previously, she served on the executive management team of BET Holdings, Inc., now Viacom, owner and operator of the BET cable networks with authority over legal affairs and later over television production operations. Ms. Coley is a former partner with the Davis Wright Tremaine and Cole, the Cole, Raywind, and Braverman law firms, where she represented cable television programmers and distributors and other media and entertainment businesses. She holds a BA in Mass Communications from Michigan State University and a law degree from Georgetown Law, where she has been the recipient of the Law Center's highest honors. Passionate about media and diversity, Ms. Coley has been an investor in several award-winning independent films produced by filmmakers of color. Mr. Clint Odom currently serves as the National Urban League Senior Vice President for Policy, Advocacy, and is the Executive Director of the Washington Bureau. Mr. Odom previously served for a decade in the United States Senate as Legislative Director for now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris of California, Democratic General Counsel for the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and General Counsel to Senator Bill Nelson of Florida. Mr. Odom also served as senior advisor at the Federal Communications Commission and practiced law at the firm Dow, Loans, and Albertson, now Cooley LLP. Mr. Odom served as a law clerk to the Honorable Henry T. Wingate of the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of Mississippi and is a graduate of Louisiana State University, go Tigers, and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Lastly, but not least, Dr. Rashawn Ray is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution and is a professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, LASSR, at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is one of the co-editors of Context Magazine, Sociology for Public, And formerly, Dr. Ray is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to the ways in which inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and nearly 20 op-eds. And also, Mr. Ray has written for the New York Times, Newsweek, Huffington Post, NBC News, selected as 40 under 40 for Prince George's County, awarded the 2016 University of Maryland Research Communicator Award, and is the member of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. So as you can tell, we have an incredible panel of distinguished guests here to speak to what technology policy means to communities of color. And I wanted to start off with the question to the whole panel: why should marginalized and multi-marginalized communities be interested in what is going on in tech policy? And how does tech policy impact the everyday life of the average person? Ms. Coley, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Bert. It's such a pleasure to be on the panel, such a distinguished panel. And as we were gathering today, I also wanted to acknowledge your legacy and history in this area. Your dad, Bert Lee, who was an amazing entrepreneur in media and technology, and also an advocate on communications policy, because this battle has been going on for a number of years, just in terms of making sure that people of color are connected to technology. And in MMTC's case, we're starting our 35th year, and we've been at the forefront, along with National Urban League, National Action Network, Leadership Council, and other Rainbow Push, of course, in terms of just making sure that tech policy is addressed, and that we drill down into the areas that are often responsible for systemic gaps. The same thing that happens in other areas, and jobs and economy, happens in broadband technology. And it's really, in terms of technology policies, technology is part of every facet of our lives. As you know, COVID has really let us know how a lot of the policy issues that we've been fighting for all these years are just thrust into front and center. Children connecting to education because they've had to go home to school, and not just the opportunities, but the disparities in terms of whether or not young people have broadband at home. It's also the education, we call that the education or the homework gap. I'm sure everyone else will talk about it as well, in terms of all things are not equal in the school system when everybody goes home, because everyone doesn't have equal access to broadband and the devices needed to connect to broadband for children to succeed. And also on the college level, we've learned through this is that things aren't equal at college, because a lot of children or young people who are in college who may have been doing just fine at college, they're in the dorms and they have access to the facilities of the university, but when they had to come home, they didn't have the same access and didn't have the same access to technology. And then government services, a lot of the government services went online. And then in COVID, you could only access certain government services online. Other things like healthcare, we've talked about, you couldn't go to your doctor, but you could have a telehealth appointment. But if you didn't have adequate broadband at home, that didn't help. And then the upskilling and reskilling opportunities, and just the whole opportunity for people like me and most of you all, the panelists on here, we can stay at home and continue to work and produce, sometimes, with our, children and our pets in the background, but it really hasn't affected certain people as much as it's affected others who did not have the opportunity to continue to work, who lost their jobs or found themselves exposed, anyway, I'll let others, I know we're going to talk about some other things, but I did want to get into the fact that this COVID situation has really thrust to the forefront the need for technology policies that address 100% digital inclusion and first-class access to technology. So I'll pass it on to one of my other panelists.
I can go in the order of the panel. I'm here at the top, in the middle of the tic-tac-toe screen. First of all, I want to thank Rainbow Push for inviting me. My very first job in government was as a young lawyer at the Federal Communications Commission in the 1990s. And Reverend Jackson was a dominant, looming force at the FCC for civil rights and for equity. I remember him being involved in just about every one of the mergers that shaped the current media landscape. The very first merger involving cable companies, AT&T and TCI. Reverend Jackson was there making sure that there were civil rights commitments, there were employment commitments, so that these huge employers that were being created did not leave people of color behind. And so to answer your question, this is why it's relevant, or at least one reason. A second reason that it's relevant is because most of the discussion around tech has been dominated by tech companies themselves, and very little discussion about ordinary people, everyday people, people of color, marginalized people, people who have no money. Why is one of the reasons why we don't talk about this. I remember speaking at an event that MMTC invited me to speak at on the 6 gigahertz band and its use for Wi-Fi. And there were huge industry segments battling over this spectrum and how it should be used. And I started a discussion about there are thousands of people dead today because of COVID. There are 50 million school children at home trying to learn remotely who may not have a computer, who may not have broadband. And although I appreciate the importance of this fight over a piece of real estate, it is in my mind overshadowed by larger events. And since that time, there are nearly 50,000 African Americans who have died from this disease. There were 3 million African Americans who lost their job from this year to last. And so there are huge challenges in this economy. There are 100,000 Black businesses that have gone out or have threatened to go under. And so if you don't think technology has anything to do with your daily life, I would say you need to think about it again, because there's no such thing as a non-technology business anymore. If you aren't online, then you are not in business. And if you are watching this on Facebook, or if you're tweeting about it, nice tweet, Marita, during the event. I appreciate your Twitter game. I responded in kind. But if you are enjoying these services and you're enjoying them for free, it's because there are tech policies that are creating the circumstance where you can get these things for free. The direction we go will determine whether or not you can continue to get it for free, or whether it'll turn out to be a subscription service, like most services when they get mature tend to be. So this is there's no more important subject, in my opinion, than what we're talking about here. And Black folks and communities of color better strap in, and they better get engaged.
So I think that when it comes to, well, first, thanks to Rainbow Push, Reverend Smith, Reverend Jackson, I continue to always just be excited when I have the opportunity to be with Rainbow Push and with the other guests. And Bert, thank you for moderating this. The bottom line is that tech is the wave of the present and the future. And when we look at Silicon Valley, particularly the demographics of Silicon Valley, what we see is that Black people continue to be left out, despite the fact that our culture is used to create generational wealth for others. Always has been. And that's one of the things that we have to alter. When I think about technology, I think about it in about 4 main ways. I've just mentioned one. Really, it's around entrepreneurship, venture capitalism, and the fact that Black people are producing things but not reaping the financial rewards from those products. Instead, they're being taken, being patented, and then other people are making money off of it. The second thing we know is that when it comes to social media is extremely powerful, but it's a gift and a curse. On one hand, without social media, many of us wouldn't have known about what happened to George Floyd, wouldn't have known about what happened to Christian Cooper, might have ended up not even seeing the video of what happened to Ahmaud Arbery. And then obviously with social media, the power backing of that is the reason why people make statements like "say her name" and resonated around what happened with Breonna Taylor. And on that point, we have to note that women, particularly Black women, are much more likely to be killed in their homes. This is the reason. This is one of the ways that technology morphs in with law enforcement. That facial recognition technology, hotspot policing, the sort of things that I study, is simply a more sophisticated way to racially profile and justify racial discrimination. That for some sort of reason it's perceived that these algorithms are more objective, and they're not. Instead, people have created them. And oftentimes those people's own biases go into informing and shaping the technologies that are used in law enforcement. We know, and we just heard this from Clint about COVID. One of the things about COVID in 2020 is that if Blacks and whites had the same mortality rate from COVID, there would be about 22,000 fewer Black people dead in 2020 alone. 22,000. These are mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, friends, other relatives that I think many of us on here probably know someone who has been impacted or passed away from COVID. But I do think that there's a promise with technology. That part of it is scaling up the entrepreneurial part. And that also deals with involving returning citizens, training them when it comes to vocational and tech training. There are huge gaps in the health field, in education, and also in tech. And these are the types of spaces that we need to be filling jobs in, and we need to ensure that there are resources that prepare Black community members for it and place these resources and jobs in Black communities. The other thing we know when it comes to technology and health is that when Black people possess more technology, they're actually more likely to trust healthcare. Some of the work that I've done with Dr. Ali Sewell shows this. In particular, when Black people attend Black Protestant churches, they are more likely to utilize healthcare. That's because the social network runs through the church. So all of a sudden, it's like, I have this pain or this is going on, and people say, you can go to Dr. So-and-so, you can trust them. They will treat us correctly. That is the logic that goes on. We also know that when Black people have more devices, more technology devices, they're more likely to search healthcare information and more likely to make informed decisions about themselves. And some of the work that I've done has been scaled up in ways that we think about technology and healthcare right now. So some of my recommendations that Congressman Hakeem Jeffries and even Governor Cuomo implemented in New York was to utilize Black churches, to utilize Black organizations, barbershops, and hair salons to utilize healthcare, because we can circumvent the distrust gap that exists between Black people and technology and healthcare. And these are the sort of ways that we need to empower local communities to make informed decisions about themselves and their loved ones.
So on that note, speaking of not only coalition building, community building, and trust, right? Sean, I do want to highlight the incredible work that you've done at the intersection of racial bias and policing. And given the nationwide protests on police violence and the subsequent articles highlighting law enforcement's use of surveillance, using recognition, and using tools such as facial recognition, drones, stingrays, and kind of like the broader digital evidence landscape that we're seeing, what is at stake for marginalized communities, specifically those within the Black and Latino communities, who are more likely to be victims of police surveillance and violence in this new policing surveillance regime?
You know, I think the consequences are severe, and I'll just highlight a few things. I wrote an article at Brookings earlier this year talking about 5 questions that policymakers should be asking about law enforcement, facial recognition, and technology and bias. And part of what some people have called it is techno racism. And it's the fact that it's simply just a more sophisticated way to engage in racial profiling. That in predominantly Black neighborhoods and cities, we see the way this technology is used, and it's problematic for a few reasons. I'll highlight a couple. First, we know that facial recognition technology, which is used all around us, has been being used in airports in particular for years, but it's now being used on public streets without people's knowledge. And we know that this technology is more likely to misclassify Black people's faces, particularly Black women. Over 33% of the time, Black women's faces are misclassified. Some of the technology, like Amazon's facial program, what they call recognition with a K, has done, I mean, look, they actually had to pull it from market, and they did that correctly. And I think they'll end up getting it right, but they pulled it because of the misclassification, the bias that's embedded within the AI software. I mean, from everything from mislabeling, they had a study where they put in criminals and California lawmakers into the same database, and the database was misclassifying California lawmakers as criminals. They've done the same thing with professional athletes in Boston, another program, misclassified them as well. Here goes the bottom line. We also know there's a gap when it comes to trusting technology. About 60% of whites trust facial recognition technology. Only 40% of Black people do. That's purposeful. Why would we trust that? So there are huge consequences on the law enforcement side for this technology being used to continue to profile and police local communities, to also justify no-knock warrants going into people's homes, and then to also be used, and these are some of the ways it's being used in the court system, to make decisions about who should get parole, who should get bail, how much their bail should be. And it's not simply about them as an individual. It's an algorithm that goes in and looks at risk and creates a risk assessment. And that risk assessment says, if you're from a particular neighborhood that might have a higher level of crime, then all of a sudden it puts your risk higher. That means the likelihood of you getting bail, that means the likelihood of people getting out on parole earlier, all of a sudden is suspended. And so we have to be extremely careful about the way that this technology is being used. And this is one of the reasons why there are a lot of advocates, from district attorneys to advocates and organizations, who are saying we need to pause this and we need to get this right.
Thank you so much for that, Rashawn. And Marita, I really want to go back to something that you said before with it, when you're talking about the homework gap and connecting, and the reason that we're doing this digitally over Zoom and over Facebook Live and not in person is because of COVID-19. You've long been a champion of broadband access for marginalized communities, and in particular, the affordability and access challenges that Black and Latino communities have had in connecting to broadband. What should we be asking this new administration and members of Congress to do better to connect those who find themselves at the other side of this digital divide, not only because of this pandemic, but because of infrastructure reasons as well?
Thanks, Bert. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge Reverend Jackson, who I see has joined us, and just wanted to, I think we will talk about this a little bit later, but to acknowledge his role in the forefront as a civil rights leader before we even had a lot of this technology, but recognizing the benefit, but also the harms that could come from, massive data collection. And we, in my generation, and Reverend Jackson's generation, we talked about civil rights and discrimination in housing, and the whole opportunity for someone to be discriminated against because they show up to answer a housing ad, and then, if they're Black, they show up and it's not available. And then, we have these, tasks where then you have someone white shows up and the apartment is all of a sudden available. I actually had a similar experience like that in college. But anyway, I wanted to thank Reverend Jackson for always being there and for continuing to connect us as we try to find solutions to these issues. We've, as I said, been working on these solutions for a long time. Even back in the 90s, we started on, this whole broadband path, and we had convenings to try to identify what some of the policy issues were that we needed to address. And back then we were talking about the same things: the access and availability issue, the affordability issue, the whole thing with relevance. Do people really find the internet and broadband to be relevant in their lives? And so now here we have, 20 years later, we're finding that we're still trying to address from a policy standpoint some of the same issues. Fortunately, some of them have been addressed with policies like, the Lifeline policy that provides a subsidy to people who are 120% of the federal poverty level to be able to get a subsidy for access to a cell phone. And now broadband. But, as these, Clint and Rayshawn and you and Reverend Jackson, we recognize that these are just a little drop in the bucket in terms of, a $9.25 a month subsidy is not really enough. And there are also, from a policy standpoint, we have Lifeline and we have, rural broadband subsidies. We have a lot of subsidies, but then there's a lot of people that are in this gap where they may not necessarily qualify for the subsidies at the poverty level, but they're still having difficulty access and affording broadband. So one of the things I think is an overarching policy, I decided that as MMTC looks at these issues, I'm going to use something I learned when I was at Black Entertainment Television, because I was there during the years when the founder, Bob Johnson, was in charge. And even though it was a public company, it was not your regular public company. We had to do all of the things that everybody else had to do to try to stay competitive, but we also had to try to, go and address the specific things in our communities that really prevented us from being relevant. So my staff then used to say that what BET had to do was that we had to learn how to drive a car while you're changing the wheels on the car. And that's how I feel about broadband policy and technology policy. Somehow we've got to continue to address the systemic inequities, address the issue with people not having broadband at home, or not having the devices, not knowing the relevance or the availability, not being able to use technology to get a job or to upskill. We've got to address those while we go back and address the systemic issues in the way that this entire technology thing is rolled out. Those of us who've been here for a long time know that there's assumptions that are made about communities of color, when in fact, Blacks and Latinos led the entire smartphone revolution because people couldn't afford internet at home. So they improvised and used smartphones largely, before other people were using it in the major markets. And so I think that those are the kinds of things in both education policy, broadband policy, jobs and upskilling. There's some tremendous opportunities, in this virtual COVID world for people to get upskilled and to get certifications. My personal laboratory is, I'm from Detroit, and this year Wayne State University had the largest incoming Black freshman class in history, largely because technology is enabling people to get a degree virtually. So they don't have to deal with the transportation issues of trying to get, how can I get to college? How can I get my transportation together? It's poor transportation system in Detroit. Who do I have to take care of my child? And so, technology helps to address those other kinds of issues. So we have a number of things that we've been working on this particular panel. I won't go into them because they are kind of wonky, but in general, we have to have some subsidies for sure. We have to be able to let people know about what's available, and we have to go and change the system from the beginning, even while from the infrastructure, even while we fill the gaps and connect the people that are disconnected. So those are what I think our challenges are. Drive the car while we're changing the tires and just accept that as our reality.
Thank you so much for that. And Clint, building on Marita's point about the new kind of like digital media landscape, recently the National Urban League hosted a panel on Section 230 and the impact that this highly contested piece of legislation has on marginalized communities. When you think about what we can do to make sure that content moderation practices are better reflective of marginalized and multi-marginalized communities, what do you think of? And do you think there are policy fixes for some of these issues that we can build off of or create to deal with this current situation?
No, and thank you for the question. And I'm a little jealous because Marita got uh, uh, probably every talk point I would have given on the need for closing the adoption gap and the availability gap and the utilization gap, and we should not lose sight of that. But specifically with respect to Section 230, this is another area that is guilty of the same sin I talked about at the front end. Too much of tech policy is talked about in ways that do not connect with people, and they don't even know what they don't know. Um, Section 230, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. It's not important that you know what Section 230 is. What you need to know is that if you are using a social media platform today, like Facebook, like Twitter, like Google, like Instagram, all of these services are running on a broadband connection, and every person who puts that platform online has the freedom to do so and the liability shield to do so because of this law that exists. And it basically says if you post something on Facebook, for instance, Facebook is not responsible for what you post. So if I say something horrible about Reverend Jackson, as horrible as it is, Facebook can't be held responsible in defamation or a related cause of action because I said something crazy. The corollary to that authority to be able to speak freely online means that Facebook, for instance, has the authority to take down something that I say about Reverend Jackson, especially if it's an incitement to violence. If and we've been seeing this, you know, people are going online. We saw this in 2016 where Russian trolls were going online and they were trying to get Black people and other people fighting against each other online, and then that violence would spill out into the real world. So what Section 230 is really all about is if marginalized communities, civil rights advocates, people who are at the intersection of race and gender identity and politics, if we are going to continue to have access to these platforms, the only way we're going to be able to have access to these platforms is if that law stays in place. There are a lot of conservatives who are talking about wiping that law off the books because they believe conservatives are being discriminated against. Their voices are not being heard. And what's the solution? President Trump's solution is we should just get rid of that protection. Well, the second that law goes away, you won't be able to go online and organize for a political rally. You won't be able to advertise a Black Lives Matter rally or some activity or vote or engage with prospective voters because there will be too much risk that that platform has to take on in order to run that ad or to air that post. So we better get engaged as Black people because it's our speech that is already on the line. Dr. Ray talked earlier about how facial recognition technology unfairly targets Black women and darker skin. Well, there is a targeting in the online world for the word Black, the word lives, and the words matter. And so many ads and so many posts get taken down unfairly because some machine algorithm is picking it up and saying these words are hateful words, or these words are calling for violence or terrorism. And nothing could be further from the truth. I was on recently on my own show talking with David Johns, who runs an organization at the intersection of Black identity and gender identity. And he told me he was blocked from putting ads up promoting AIDS awareness for Black men or LGBTQIA. It gets flagged because there's an algorithm out there that says this is a dangerous ad. So before the government starts telling us what we can say online and what we can do online, I say we as social activists need to work with the companies themselves to get this hateful speech or this unfair speech offline And I'd just rather work with the companies than to work with social conservatives who are really bent on elevating their own voice over my voice and over the voices of other people of color. That's it in a nutshell.
No, and thank you, Clint, because I think you build into the next question really well, particularly on not only the impact that these platforms have had on communities of color, but kind of like what COVID has laid bare about the deep racial inequities in our nation, from disparate health outcomes to the massive economic toll this pandemic is taking on Black and Latino communities that Marita and Clint and Rashawn, that you all have highlighted earlier in the conversation. With that said, as Clint said just now, algorithms have become an even larger part of our lives than before. Dictating everything from who gets benefits and employment opportunities to housing and credit, even healthcare, to what is happening in policing, to what content stays up or comes down based on the platform. And so I would just like to open this up to the broader panel, and Rashawn, Marita, and then Clint will go in that order if that's okay with everybody. What should equity and justice policy around some of these issues include, right? And you don't have to take all of them, you can take some, but what does racial equity, racial justice and equity really look like around these policy concerns?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So what I think policymakers have to do is think about what are the correct questions to ask. Part of what's happening with technology, and Clint just spoke to this a second ago about the way that the algorithms work, even the way that the words are used to discriminate against different people. We have to recognize that when it comes to the First Amendment, that restrictions to the First Amendment oftentimes lay bare on the most marginalized among us who are trying to use their voice to circumvent traditional modes of communication. I do think social media does that, but the policing of that can disproportionately impact marginalized groups and Black people more than other groups. So I think when it comes to policymakers, as the speed of the technology moves, they have to think about what are the correct questions to ask. And I think there are some specific ones that should be asked. So for example, has the community been informed and had the opportunity to ask questions and give suggestions? Oftentimes, these technologies are just unilaterally implemented in areas, and people don't even know that they're there. And this is something that people should recognize and understand and be able to contribute to, because it's their tax money that's making decisions on it. More importantly, what safeguards are put in place to ensure that the technology is being used properly and is working as it is intended to be. What this means is what we have to realize, and I work in this space having a virtual reality lab at Maryland that law enforcement officers go through, that I think is amazing, super innovative, second to none, but I know this process very, very well. Part of what happens is that there is not a lot of oversight for private companies doing this type of work. So what that means is you can come to a police department, for example, and say, hey, we have $15,000, $30,000, $50,000. We're gonna pay you to use it. We're just gonna track the data. Law enforcement officers get excited. It's the shiny new toy. And then all of a sudden, it's similar to what Marita was saying about how you're trying to drive the car while you're fixing it at the same time. Like you're changing the tire as it's moving down the tracks. Part of what that means then is that the bias is going to come out more. And now they're going to be using this technology to make these decisions. So what we need to have happen is legislation that says we need to see proof of concept past an experimental phase. It cannot be used until that process happens. And then we need to ensure that the bias is alleviated. So we need to use academic standards, significant tests, as we call them, randomized controlled trials, where we can be confident that 99 out of 100 times that when this technology is used, that it's going to be used equitably. So this helps to guard against bias. And then I think it's also important to think about how the technology moves beyond consent to really include privacy concerns. I mean, these are serious, serious issues. So it's about the questions that policymakers need to ask. And we need to ensure that experts are sitting at the table, not just CEOs of companies that are trying to push their products and reduce regulation so that they can do what they do, but academics, researchers, practitioners to come in and inform policymakers about, well, look, it's not that this shouldn't happen, but it's more so that these are the safeguards that need to be in place for these things to happen. And I think that helps you improve equity, because I mean, the whole thing about how facial recognition misclassifies people's faces, I've known people who've been arrested for things like that. Like, I mean, this is real life for people. And these are the sort of things that should not be happening. So this technology should not be deployed until we know that it is racially equitable. And right now it is imbued with racism similar to people's own biases in everyday life.
I wanted to say absolutely the same thing that Rashawn said. And I want to give this is sort of a primitive example, but before we found out how algorithms were really, really hurting our communities, we would make jokes about, your phone, the feature where it collects pictures of people who it thinks are the same people. And so I had a thing that I would tease Masai Gisese at TV1. I said, oh, my phone thinks you're my brother, Derek. And we were laughing about it back then because, it pulled together, here's your family members. And then he would end up in my, pictures on my phone. This was before we realized that that's a very low level, low tech version of what's been happening with these algorithms. And the fact that these algorithms can impose a permanent life sentence on the people that we care about the most. It's happened to people that I know and care about. And so I think that, what Rashawn said, I think is perfect. It actually it builds on what I was going to say. I said we need to invest. Number one, we need to invest in the proof of concept and also in correcting when you find out that the algorithms are biased. And when we found out, as you said, for instance, that Amazon was already involved with law enforcement and already using this technology, and we found out that it disproportionately harms browner people or brown women or darker skinned women, why is this still happening? There should be from a policy standpoint, we need to have a proof of concept. You wouldn't put a vaccine out there without proving the concept. And we need to do this with respect to these algorithms. These things punish people for life. You have something that comes up, whether it's, on your criminal background, whether you were arrested. There are these sites that post your what do you call it? Your mugshot. These sites that post your mugshot. If you were arrested, they post them online. So then you're trying to get a job. Let's say you were arrested, but nothing ever came from it. But then an employer goes to try to, look you up, and then you've got this mugshot, and they don't even know what the adjudication of it. We need to stop that kind of thing from harming people and keeping them locked out of opportunities permanently. We also need to invest in diverse hires, because in the algorithms, the reason that there are so many problems is in the coding. So there's no diverse coding, there's no diverse input. That's why they can't tell the difference between me and Whoopi, and so it's like there's all these things that are baked into the infrastructure that are wrong. And from a policy standpoint, we need to get at the root of the issue with the algorithms. And then the last thing that I was thinking of is just investing in the pipeline, as we're doing, in terms of making sure that young people understand that these are opportunities. You don't have to be an engineer to be in the tech world, but just to make sure that we create a steady pipeline of next generation workers that are building these systems and weighing in on them.
I agree with everyone.
Oh,
absolutely, Reverend Jackson.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm delighted you're here today. I want to thank Steve Smith, very especially, for making it possible. Thank you, Steve. I want to make several observations. Number one, the political cement is wet right now. They're forming policies even as we talk. One of my concerns is that you represent the best we have in what you do. Too few people know you. We had sessions like this Wednesday and Thursday, which form a kind of telecom communications manifesto, make our collective demands, work out according with your specialty it may be. And that was in Bible time, when that was a biblical time, when that was God told Noah there was going to be a flood. And some people didn't deal with them. They thought they could swim. You can swim. You can't swim without an ark together. I'm anxious for us to work together to form the people to see put together, we work together, what we can do about making this thing happen. And I look at Bertram Lee and you, Marie, and all that. I'm concerned as an organizer. How do we raise it up the scale? Because who knows you exist? Too few people. So I want to also be able to relate to you in a way that can enhance what you're doing. We're going to have a new FCC chairman. That's how we can determine who will be. How do we relate to the new FCC? What do we want from the FCC? I'm not sure that. We know there's 62 blacks in the Congress now. We're not stop long to figure out how to use them. They'll be able to be used. Most of us can't name 10 of them. 62 black congressmen and vice president and all that. So I want us to stop for a moment. We can't do it physically no time soon given the pandemic. But with the next week, we need to have us a broader meeting. Those of you, Larry and others on the phone yesterday and the day before, what we do, put together our hands. If we remember Joe right now, what we tell them we want. It couldn't just be, we need certain policies. We need certain policies. We need certain protection. Certain guarantees. So I'm anxious to work with you. I want to express my thanks to Steve for outstanding work putting you together. But to have all these brilliant minds together, unless you're organized, you have the power to make your agenda known. I thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Well, you know, as usual, Reverend Jackson hits it out the park and puts his finger on exactly what the issue is. And it's really, what is our proximity to power? Are we at the table? Or are we at the little kids' table? Or do we not even know the meeting is taking place? As someone who has been in this town for over 30 years, I'm still finding doors that I didn't even know were doors, much less what the entry key to that door is. Reverend Jackson, I have some confidence, and I'm an optimist here, that issues of racial justice and racial equity are on the minds of the people with power, and they're on the minds of the people who are going to be making these decisions. For example, there's a Federal Communications Commission agency review team. Now, in my 30 years of being in Washington, including working for a chairman and a commissioner, I didn't know anything about this process. Didn't know how you participate in this process. Didn't even know that people could meet with these people. Because of the transparency in the Biden-Harris administration, we now know who those people are. There are four. Three of those four people are people of color. Two are African American. I have every reason to believe that this administration is going to be focused on social justice issues in a way that it has not in recent history, and maybe not even since the creation of the Kerner Commission.
I cut you all on to say that getting our share will not be inevitable, because we in fact organize and have the demand structure. I was picking back in the day, one time we took at a restaurant, many days. There's a saying that day, we didn't expect to go in. We ate at the cafeteria. We realized, who's gonna pay for this? We didn't have any money. You know, another time, the man was, what y'all want to say, freedom now. We didn't have public accommodation bill. You know, we just, so I'm saying that you are, which I say clearer, that your expertise is so awesome. We as the people don't know how to use you effectively. Black brothers, I hope that comes off right. How related to you and Larry people like that. We don't know. I think that when Biden and Kamala meet, they need to know that we exist as an organized group with kind of telecom demands. I'm asking you to work with Larry and others and put together a demand structure. So we do meet with Biden and Kamala. We're going to make our case collectively. Okay?
We hear you loud and clear on that, Reverend. And I think after many decades of not having ourselves together at these critical transition times, I think we have ourselves together in ways that you will be very pleased to hear about, and a plan to present not only to this new administration, but also to the Congress, which leads with racial equity and justice in a way, again, that I have not seen since the development of the Kerner Commission report, which sat on a shelf and sits on a shelf to this day. I think we've got a rare moment of a plan and people who are willing to execute the plan. And I take your point, the potential growth of the Black Caucus is notable. I count 8 African Americans coming into the House, 6 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and the potential even for people of color to grow in the United States Senate. There's one Latino gentleman who is will be sworn in to the Senate. Although Kamala Harris will be leaving to become vice president, we have an opportunity for the governor to put a person of color in her place. And as I've been saying, there's a very high likelihood that we will gain another African-American senator from appointment as a result of a sitting senator departing for the Biden administration. So I'm very encouraged that the plan and the people who can implement the plan are finally coming together. And we're going to be talking more about that, Reverend.
Do one pedestrian thing for me.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'll just be members of the Rainbow Push Coalition. www.rainbowpush.org.
You are on board.
Just by convening us, I want them to see a critical mass of us. We as a people, ministers, we don't know what you do, what you can do, or what you are doing, what you have done. I'm speaking for myself, I'm speaking for other people. I'm fascinated with what you do, what you know. It's technical, it's smart, it's an individual. I want to be collective. Thank you guys very much, okay?
Thank you, Reverend. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Reverend. And I want to take this moment because I know Rashawn has to leave. And I want to say thank you, Rashawn, for your expertise. And I do want to say, if you are interested in hearing and learning more about Rashawn's incredible work, and I cannot say enough how incredible Rashawn's work is, please follow him at Brookings Institution. So Rashawn, I'll let you kind of like sign off on your own accord on that note.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's great to be here with everybody. And you all have a happy holiday season. Thank you.
Take care. Take care, Dr. Ray. And on this, and just a quick point on tech, AI or algorithmic bias in the criminal justice system or the legal system. We've had technology developments that have come into play, as late as the 20th century, fingerprints, polygraphs, and all of those instruments of science that could create evidence that leads to the conviction of someone. We've always had certain levels of testing and assuredness before they can be used. There's a reason polygraph evidence can't be used in a court of law, right? There's a reason that DNA evidence took so long to be introduced as something that could be used to sustain a conviction. And there was also a backstop of the courts, and courts that were very protective of our civil liberties. One of the issues, in the panoply of issues that we need to be worried about is our federal courts. And do we have federal courts these days and justices and judges who are going to stand up for the old maxim, it is better that 10 guilty men go free than one innocent person be convicted? Or are we going to have a judiciary as a backstop that basically turns a blind eye to civil liberties? I'm not ready to say what's going to happen in that realm. But I can tell you what keeps me up at night: worried about myself, worried about my children, worried about my community. And so, also want to give a shout out to Travis LeBlanc, who's a member of the U.S. Privacy Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the only African American serving on that board. And I feel like he's out there looking at these issues from the standpoint of recommendations to the government. And I think we should thank him for the work that he's doing, and hope that between these proof of concept, scientific acceptance in the community, with a backstop of the courts, we can get someplace that leaves our communities in a good spot. A breakdown in any one of them is real jeopardy for our communities and our individual liberties.
And Bert,
Rita, I want to pass it to you. Yes,
yeah, I was going to say,
absolutely.
if I can just, first of all, acknowledge what Reverend Jackson was saying, because we have had these conversations before about how our organizations are very inside the beltway, wonky tech, we have this access to this information, but what is happening for this information to get out into our communities? So I wanted to acknowledge his concern and the fact that we have been working on that. And in particular, we've been working with Urban League, because Urban League, Rainbow Push have boots on the ground, whereas MMTC is inside the beltway, and we're helping to work on policy from that vantage point. But I've been very encouraged, as Clint has said, about the fact that the Biden administration has been reaching out to us, and we're not the Urban League, we're not Rainbow Push, but it's clear that it's different. Everything is totally different than what we've experienced in recent years, and just basically wanting to have our voice and our input in the plans that they're making, whether it's on racial justice or whether it's on broadband or criminal justice. So I can, as Reverend Jackson is concerned, I think I share with Clint that I think things are different, and our organizations have all been working together to create some plans and recommendations that could make an impact. And then Rayshawn's off, but I wanted to say Rayshawn is an example. He's at Brookings, Rayshawn, Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee is at Brookings, and Andre Perry and Rodney Sampson, who's on our board. And so we are seeing that there are some changes that are taking place, because you have these highly technical subject matter experts whose voices are now being heard, and whose papers are being, written and cited in these efforts to make sure that technology policy reflects the harms caused and the opportunities that come from technology.
And I do want to take this moment to kind of plug my employer, the Leadership Conference on
Leadership
Human Rights, and which Mr. Odom, the National Urban League are a part of. And we've been talking with not only the transition, but we put out we have a media and telecommunications task force. We have set our priorities for this new administration, but another place in which the Leadership Conference has a seat at the table is the broader civil rights table, with a lot of the major tech policy organizations who have put out a set of civil rights principles for the era of big data for 2020, which we are consistently push out, because these are principles in which not only the civil rights community has embraced, but also the tech policy organizations. And so that when we move on tech policy, we at least lead with these issues of civil rights and civil liberties. And so I think I want to take those moments to highlight those two things, and then use that as a transition to talk about data privacy, which is, I think, the fundamental and I think the bedrock foundation of what the AI and algorithms that engage in bias are based off of, which is flawed data and data that is skewed to look a certain kind of way when it looks at communities of color. And so data privacy is even more important now than ever, as digital surveillance is the norm rather the exception with respect to how we learn and how we work. And so how should this Congress and new administration look at data privacy, specifically through the lens of how it impacts marginalized communities? Ms. Coley, I'll lead with you, and then Clint, you want to follow us? You want to close? I'll close with you, Clint. Sorry about that.
Thanks. And I think the number one thing is that we need to make sure that this administration, that our policy leaders recognize data privacy as an essential right. We have worked with all of your organizations on, making sure that the importance of data privacy, the portability of data privacy, the establishing frameworks that address a broad policy framework that is consistent wherever it is, so that you don't have different, rules or different, efforts to comply, so that everyone kind of knows, this is the baseline. These are going, I've recommended in our filings that there actually even be like a safe harbor, because our concern is that when you have data privacy regulations, a lot of them require that somebody knowingly say, yes, I accept this, or no, I don't want you to collect my data. We in our filings have actually gone a little bit further and recommended that there be some kind of a fundamental safe harbor in certain areas, particularly dealing with financial, health, and other sensitive data. There be a safe harbor where companies would comply at a certain level, where they wouldn't collect certain data, because you might have vulnerable people who might say, okay, not knowing what they're getting into. But I think most of the conversation has been around making sure that data privacy is considered an essential right, and also looking at the different structures. There's the European structure, there's the California law that's been into effect, and kind of looking at how things go and seeing what the new framework should look like. But I think the consistent thing has been that we've advocated that there be a comprehensive national privacy framework, so that you're not looking at, okay, I'm in Ohio and I'm subject to one regulation, but then when I go to, California, it'll be another another regulation. So we actually had a couple of, I'll just read you from our privacy recommendations from one of our recent filings. We believe in strong privacy protections for individual control of personal information, a commitment to the digital divide, and to cybersecurity training, because that goes back to what I said before about some vulnerable communities may not have the technological proficiency to really understand what's okay and what's not okay. So we do need a commitment to closing the digital divide and having cybersecurity training. We talked about the algorithmic discrimination, that we want that to be included in the policies. Consistent rules and equal treatment across the entire internet ecosystem, so that if you're on Comcast or if you're on Facebook, that it's the same. It's not that some people get a lesser standard. And we had to really look at that, because we had some of our partners who were like, well, small businesses shouldn't be subjected to the same privacy standard as these big tech companies. And that these really difficult, complex privacy regulations actually benefit big tech. This is easier for them to comply. But we had to, basically say, look, we need to get on the same page about these, because if it's a small business, you shouldn't have a lesser privacy standard than a large business. So those are things in our recommendations that we're looking at. And then overall protections to have a safe user experience, preserve constitutional principles. And we're also working with groups like NUL and other groups to come up with a diversity mandate in the tech sector. And I don't know how we're going to do this, but we have had that conversation that this is such a big area that we really do need to have representation of diverse voices in order to make sure the policies reflect the diversity of America. So those are ours.
Yeah, I remember distinctly the pre-COVID era because Marita and some of our colleagues gathered at the offices of the National Urban League to talk about this very thing. Yeah, I think data breach fatigue has gotten to the point where, again, communities of color don't always know what they don't know. They don't know what's going on, and they don't know how to fix it. You know, we over-index over just about all racial groups on the use of smartphones and applications involving social media companies and other companies that collect data. So our buy-in here, you know, we've got a lot of skin in the game, and there has not been much in the way of a unifying principle out there. As somebody who spent about a decade in Congress and having, especially on the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Senate Commerce Committee, I can tell you I have some ideas that I think would be very consistent with what Marita has talked about, and that I think we'll be talking a lot more about in the weeks to come. As a initial matter, a threshold matter, this is an area, frankly, that only Congress can fix. I mean, administrations come and go. Some administrations are focused on this, some are not, but you very quickly run up against the limits of what you can do in terms of appropriations and in terms of authority. So we would recommend that there be an extensive series of hearings as early as, you know, starting in the first 100 days of Congress, to talk about privacy implications and to introduce into that discussion, in a way that has not really been discussed before, the unique privacy challenges for communities of color. Secondly, I can tell you, as someone who was a so-called expert in the Congress, members are dangerously uninformed on these issues. And the thought of people who do not have sufficient training in law or technology policy making these decisions, it should be frightening to all of us. And so one modest step would be to restore the Office of Technology Assessment that used to be the brain trust for the United States Congress on a number of issues, including this issue. That office has been shuttered. It needs to be reopened, and it needs to be fully funded in a way so that we can bring into the Congress, into the staffing, into our planning, people who are from civil society and civil liberty advocates, people who come from, from the industry, come from state and local governments, because there's a big stakeholder base out there that's largely, you know, either part of the food fight or not even aware that there's a fight going on. There's another question in my mind as to whether or not the current alphabet soup of federal agencies that have a touch on federal policy should be either have their jurisdictional roles expressly defined, or maybe, and you know, I'm sure nobody will hear this recommendation, but just the four of us here on the screen, maybe it's time to start taking a look at another agency, creating another agency. I mean, we did this for Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This is the practice in other countries. Maybe it's time, you know, to do it here. I've got a few more recommendations on how, you know, on what the FCC and FTC could contribute, but I don't think those move the needle. To me, maybe one of the biggest, most aggressive steps we could take here is to say this is an important enough an issue that maybe we need to have its own. Maybe we need to create something out of whole cloth. If we can't do this during COVID, you know, a time in which people understand there are major challenges in this country that require big and bold changes, then there may not be another time, you know, to persuade lawmakers that this is what's necessary.
So, first of all, Clint, the creating another agency idea is near and dear to my heart, as I worked with Harold Feld, who wrote extensive work called the Digital Platform Act. And in it, I think one of the things that, especially given the Supreme Court's new decision or recent decision on our deference, Kaiser v. Wilkie, I think whatever agency or ideas that we have, whether it's the FTC, FCC, or a new digital platform agency, all of them need to be able to center civil rights and have that expertise in agency, or else any promulgation of regulation along those lines is going to get kicked out on a Supreme Court decision that Justice Kagan wrote, on an opinion that Justice Kagan wrote.
It's the same phenomenon you discussed earlier. If you don't, you know, it's better to put the tire on before you start the car than to try to put it on once the car is started. Put all of this, put all the right people in place before you start doing this. And you can do it in a way that doesn't hamper innovation. We don't want to be someone who says we should cede our lead in innovation to anybody. But you know, these are explosives, live explosives that we're playing with. And they deserve more attention than giving to them now.
And I really do want to highlight that with the live explosive aspect, not only with kind of like what's happening and what we're seeing on algorithmic bias across a litany of issues, right? From traditional civil rights areas like housing, employment, and credit, right? But also kind of like algorithmic bias and how Black people are over-indexed in the data in some spaces and then under-indexed in others, right? Is the data about people of color and the outcomes, and thus the algorithms that are created, does it produce equitable results in which everyone has not only accurate data about them and really meaningful data about them, right? But also data that is that, and but also adds to I would say an algorithm and to an environment where equity is at the forefront of these issues, not the thing that we're fixing at the very, very end. And so I want to kind of like open up the floor for a minute and a half for both you, Ms. Cooley, and you, Mr. Odom, just to kind of like have kind of like your space to be able to say things that are kind of like close. And so to the people who have stayed with us on this conversation, what are some of the things that you would say to them and places in which you guys would look for a minute and a half, as it is 1:12 and we end at 1:15?
I think the number one thing that I'd like to say is that, as Reverend Jackson said, because he has stepped in before on really, high level policy discussions, and he's reminding us that we have to work together. And as Clint said, before COVID, we were gathering together in the same room and we were coming up with these, unified policies. And we had, Steve and NUL and MMTC and NAN, and now we'll have Leadership Council and others, just to, put our minds and our heads and our experiences together so that our recommendations not only address the systemic issues, with biases, but also the opportunities that technology affords for upskilling and helping us to live better quality of lives. So what I'd like to do is to definitely commit MMTC, but also to propose that we just continue these conversations, whether NUL is at the lead or whomever, but just to continue these and just build on what we were doing, before COVID, because now that the COVID has pushed all of our issues to the forefront. Some of the issues that we were dealing with, nobody was paying attention to. Now, all of a sudden, everybody's kids are at home and they don't have internet. And so now it's become, an issue, or, grandma needs to go to the doctor, but it's COVID, but she doesn't have the technology or the proficiency to be examined at home. And so what I would like to say is just committing to our collaboration of our groups. We need all of us in order to bring about these changes. And I'm going to pledge MMTC to that effort.
What I would suggest is what I have suggested here of government and of our groups largely under the umbrella of civil rights or not for profits. We need to come together with plans that are not just big tent or just one side of the tent. We need to come together with a plan that includes the people who will have a say in building the infrastructure and whose businesses will be impacted by what we're talking about here. If government is guilty of the sin of not bringing in civil rights organizations in policymaking, if corporations are guilty of not bringing in communities of color and other representatives of marginalized groups into their product lines when they are developing these products, then as civil rights advocates, we must not be guilty of the sin of omission in trying to put forward a set of principles or guides that are divorced from the people, who may have to actually, implement it. Now, we've got to make sure that as subscribers to these services, that we aren't the only people who are paying for this. What COVID has laid bare is that without public funding to get some of this done, it ain't going to happen. The Washington Post has a story today talking about the Biden transition teams work on passing emergency broadband relief. The notion of publicly funded subsidies for people who can no longer afford, access to services or whose communities don't have them. That's got to be an essential. We need to have a big enough tent to be able to put something forward in this moment, because this moment will pass, and shame on all of us if we've not been able to get together a plan that is actionable and is achievable and that addresses the problems of the country.
And I think that is a great note to end it on. And so, Reverend Smith, if I may ask, if I may just allow myself a little bit of this, I will just say on behalf of Dr. Rashawn Way, of behalf of Ms. Cooley, Mr. Odom, Reverend Smith, and Reverend Jackson, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Bertram, and thank you to all of our distinguished panel of guests. Rainbow Push has been on the forefront of these particular issues for a long time now, and we want to invite you to share with us in this work and in our efforts. We want to invite you to go to www.rainbowpush.org and consider becoming a member of our organization. Again, that's www.rainbowpush.org, and consider being a member of our organization. We also want to invite you to view we want to thank our sponsors, Verizon Communications, Charter Communications, Comcast Communications, Motion Picture Association of America, and T-Mobile. We want to turn the rest of our panel discussion over to the remarks from a few of our sponsors.
Hello, my name is Marie Silla Dixon. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this year's Media and Telecommunications Symposium. T-Mobile's proud to support the Rainbow Push Coalition's efforts to chart a path forward for digital education and economic inclusion. We believe the work of Reverend Jackson and the coalition is critical to moving the needle on social justice issues that heavily impact the communities we serve. The global pandemic has highlighted educational achievement gaps throughout the country. Studies have reported learning loss will probably be greatest among low-income Black and Brown students. As a company, we're committed to addressing these gaps and providing resources to help ensure these students are not robbed of a future. At T-Mobile, we're rethinking how we do things and are focused on investing in our communities and providing resources for empowerment. That's why we've pledged $25 million across community initiatives that support technology, education, and workforce training. And that's not all. T-Mobile has launched Project 10 Million, our multi-billion-dollar effort to eradicate the homework gap for millions of children. The project provides free wireless, broadband service, hotspots, access to tablets and laptops, and up to 100 gigabytes of free data per year to 10 million households over 5 years. It is also addressing the increased needs brought on by the pandemic by allowing school districts that participate in Project 10 Million to sign up for one of 2 new low-cost plans with more data. We have pledged to expand and improve affordable wireless capabilities within the new T-Mobile's coverage area to low-income communities, underserved minority populations, and rural areas. We understand connectivity plays an essential role in distance learning and are deploying a 5G network that will be accessible to all. Thank you, Reverend Jackson and the Rainbow Push family for your vision and continued commitment to advocating for our communities. I am looking forward to today's critical discussion. Thank you.
Greetings, I'm John Gibson, Vice President of External and Multicultural Affairs at the Motion Picture Association. The MPA is proud to sponsor this year's Media and Telecommunications Symposium. In fact, just a few years ago at this very symposium, Reverend Jackson introduced us to our now adopted school, the Richard Wright Public Charter School for Journalism and Media. Magic always seems to happen when Rainbow Push and the MPA collaborate, and this year is no different. So on behalf of Ambassador Charlie Rivkin and the MPA family, we wish you all an incredible symposium. Thank you.